So this is my audience. My name is Nashaly Collazo, and I will be presenting on international finance institutions and their effects on Jamaica specifically. So imagine that you need help, and instead of doing that, someone takes advantage of your vulnerability and pushes you down. This is exactly what happens to countries all over the world by structural adjustment programs that integrate policies that hinder social, political, and economic progression. So Jamaica, much like nations all over the world, continue to reap the consequences of accepting financial aid from monetary institutions that exploit them and push forth their own agendas. Some of these monetary institutions include the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Essentially, they loan money to countries that are looking to stabilize their economies, but without specifying terms of repayment. International finance institutions or these structural adjustment programs are established by more than one country looking to financially aid nations that are experiencing severe economic instability, and one of the victims of said financial aid is Jamaica. So former Prime Minister Michael Manley was forced to sign the first loan agreement with the IMF in 1977 due to the lack of variable alternative, which is very common in the global south. It grew strongly in the early years of independence, but then stagnated in the 1980s due to they were burdened by persistent large fiscal and external deficits. In effect, Jamaica was subject to short-term plans of repayment of their debt by the IMF and suffer even more to this day. This meant that the IMF had generally negative effects on the Jamaican economy as opposed to their goals of aiding. So one of these goals of the IMF's presence in Jamaica was to reduce inflation by balancing the nation's repayments and imports with exports earnings, and typically that results in a recession. So similarly, the World Bank aimed to turn rather than transition Jamaica's borrower economy into a free trade economy, and that furthered economic damage. And they did this by proposing a market deregulation, sometimes accompanied by new lending from the World Bank and other private lenders, making the whole situation cyclical. So the IMF and the World Bank, they increased their interest rates, they exploited the cheap labor, and they imposed short repayment plans, all of which hindered Jamaica financially. So the structural programs such as the IMF and the World Bank, they preserve their personal interest, and this is showcased through present-day effects. The consequences of the IMF in Jamaica have been devastating, and the country continues to be poor despite the financial aid. Public debt in Jamaica is at 160% rate and consumes most of the government's expenditures. The country is experiencing extreme poverty due to high inflation and unemployment rates. And because the IMF and the World Bank impose unnecessary and sometimes harmful conditions on borrowing countries, they block their road to recovery. These financial institutions are poorly aided, and they are exploited because they are vulnerable, and the financial institutions maintain that economic dominance through the exploitation. Because the IMF and the World Bank have so much influence and power, they can set the low wages and shorten the repayment plans to obstruct any true economic progress in countries like Jamaica. The vulnerability that Jamaica was experiencing was exploited through their cheap labor and the policies that forbade assistance in their financial crisis. Although it is pretty unrealistic to attempt to stop these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, bringing awareness to the issue is a great start.